Welcome back everyone to Data Science for Everyone. Today we're going to be talking about interviews. Let's get started. So the research interview can take a number of different forms, from the very structured to the formal interview, which is usually a researcher-administered questionnaire, to the very informal, purposeful conversation, which is led by the participant, with the researcher not taking control of the process until it comes to the analysis and interpretation. The only way to become good at an interviewer is to practice. There is no secret formula to becoming an expert interviewer if there is such a thing. It is all down to knowing your topic and knowing yourself and how you react in the interview situation. Knowing your topic is the easy part. Your literature review should have you steeped in the topic. Interviews are used frequently in information and library research. There are many more examples of research studies that are used in interviews to gain in-depth understanding of individual perceptions. Before you decide on what form of interview will suit you best, you have to decide if the interview is the most appropriate technique to use. In order to help you make this decision, you have to understand the purpose of a research interview. What can an interview contribute to your research? What can an interview do that no other technique could do, or at least not to do as well? Is the interview fit for purpose? Once you've made the decision, then you can go on and decide on what form of interview will take and the details of the process. The purpose of an interview is to access what was in or on the interviewee's mind. We interview when that is the most appropriate way to access the data we need. Other constraints will always drive decisions about data collection, but the predominant factor should always be the nature of the data we seek and the type of questions that we need to ask to access that data. Interviews are usually used when we are seeking qualitative, descriptive, in-depth data that is specific to the individual and when the nature of the data is too complicated to be asked and answered easily. This does not apply to the researcher-administered questionnaires, but all other interviews allow for some degree of interaction between the researcher and the subject. Interviews can be used for reconstruction of events, descriptions, and the feelings about current events and predictions of future events. You are discovering individual opinions. The information you get from interviews is different from the pure factual data. If you want precise dates, times, and measures, or any type of quantifiable data, interviews are not really the most appropriate tool to use. It is very rare that individuals can instantly recall any great quantity of precise factual data without consulting records of some kind. The interview situation is not particularly conducive to the reproduction of complicated or exact data. You will talk to people to discover what they think, feel, and remember about events. Interviews allow people to respond to their own terms and within their own linguistic parameters, providing the interviewer with the opportunity to clarify the meaning and shared understanding. The process is not always linear. Depending on the nature of interviews, analysis could begin as soon as the first interview is complete. In the case of purposeful conversation, this should most definitely be the case. We can use these stages as a broad outline of the process to be prepared for iteration, particularly in the final 3 stages when engaging in unstructured interviews. The 7 stages of the interview process are thematizing, designing, interviewing, transcribing, analyzing, verifying, and reporting. Thematizing. This is the why and what of the investigation that needs to be clarified before the question of how. Before even thinking about particular interview types or formats, you need to be clear about the purpose of your research and the topic that you are investigating. You need to establish themes within your topic and make sure that these themes are appropriate to each interviewee. In many studies, you may be asking different people different things. Once you have identified your themes, you should attempt to structure them in a natural order that allows the interviewee to follow a logical thought process and allows you, the interviewer, to gain a growing understanding of the feelings and behaviors and beliefs. The purpose of using an interview guide is to ensure that each interview covers basically the same ground but gives the interviewer considerable discretion in the conduct of the interview. The degree in which the guide controls an interview depends on how much of the interview type. The guide can range from a very strict script, not only providing predetermined questions, but also providing a limited number of response categories, to a list of topics the interviewer simply wishes to cover. Your design will depend very much on the type of interview that you decide to engage in. For a structured formal interview, you would be better advised to read and watch the next video and design a very strict guide or a questionnaire. Conduct interviews based on an interview guide with a reflective approach to the knowledge sought and the interpersonal relation of the interview situation. Interviewing depends on the rapport built between the interviewer and the interviewee. It is the responsibility of the interviewer to make the interviewee feel comfortable and relaxed. This is not an easy task for inexperienced interviewers, not least because they are likely to be rather nervous themselves. This is why I always recommend that although highlighting for structure and question style, it is extremely important for you to also practice your technique. First impressions count. When you arrive at the interview, make sure that you are dressed appropriately. If you appear relaxed, your interviewee is much more likely to open up and relax too. But remember that there is a difference between relaxed and complacent. You need to know your questions and truly know what sense that you are completely aware of and why you are there, not just to recite the questions rigidly. You need to be able to flow with the situation. Listen carefully and follow up on what you hear and learn. Interviews demand preparation, so prepare thoroughly. Timing is also very important. When you request an interview, you must indicate how much time you will be taking up, and it is important that you do not exceed the time you have asked for. Finishing early is okay, but you definitely make sure to not overstay your welcome. Try to estimate as accurately as possible the time the interview will take. This should be easier after their first real interview, but the pilot test will help you before you enter the field. The types of interviews you decide on depends first on the nature of your research topic and the sort of data you need to collect to respond to your research question. After that, there are the more practical considerations such as your own experience, the time you have available, and the number of respondents that you want to reach, and also your analysis. Think very carefully about the best way to gather data. Analyze the 100 questionnaires or are closed fixed response interviews is a lot less complicated than analyzing 20 unstructured in-depth conversations. Traditionally, this has been associated with a mutual reading of the presentation of self. In any social situation, there is a swift appraisal of age, gender, ethnicity, of accent, dress, and personal grooming, of conventionality, eccentricity, and subculture markers. On the, of course, confidence levels and physical attractiveness, friendliness, and restraint. In addition, oral dimensions of language, so tone, pitch, etc., might identify whether that what was said was spoken for a position of confidence, doubt, irony, etc. Structured interviewing refers to a situation in which an interviewer asks each respondent a series of pre-established questions with a limited set of response categories. This is often referred to as a researcher-administered questionnaire, or it is also highly structured and follows many of the same guidelines as a questionnaire. You will be very limited here in terms of acting as a research instrument. The structured interview framework is actually an instrument here, and you must resist the temptation to react and respond or expand the contents of the framework. There are two forms of structured interview. In a standardized open-ended interview, all interviewees are asked the same open-ended questions, but are allowed to respond in any way that they feel is appropriate and with any information they choose to share. In a closed, fixed response interview, interviewees are asked the same questions and choose from a predetermined set of alternative answers. It is also possible to use a combination of these two methods. Although this type of interview is similar to the questionnaire, the major benefit is the visual and oral cues which you can pick up on by listening to and watching your respondent. Although the content of the interview remains standardized, your role as a research instrument can still be used in terms of interpreting the nature of the response. For example, was the answer given ironically? Does the interviewee look nervous or confident? You can learn a lot about how something is said. It is not only what it is said that contributes to your research. Of course, there is also an increased control the researcher has over response rates. You leave each interview with your data complete, and you can measure as you go how much data you are gathering. This eliminates the risk of poor response rates so common with the typical questionnaire distribution. There is also the added benefit of being able to pre-code as you would with a questionnaire. This saves time during the analysis. It is recommended that the structured interview approach to anyone who is new to the interview process. Unstructured interviews are used to gain a holistic understanding of the thoughts and feelings of the interviewee. You are there to learn about their point of view. Often, this type of interview is used in the early stages of the research to explore salient issues for further investigation. Unstructured interviews are concerned with open-ended questions that allow the interviewee to tell their own story in their own words. Two approaches to conducting unstructured interviewing: the formal conversation and the general interview guide. The informal conversational interview is a purposeful conversation. It is important to allow questions to follow from the immediate context. You must listen carefully and respond to the interviewee. Listen and respond as you would in any conversation, taking care to steer your interviewee along your lines of interest. In a guided interview, the researcher prepares a basic checklist to make sure that all relevant areas of the topic are covered. You are still free to explore, probe, and ask a question not previously specified when something interests you. This type of interview approach is usually useful for eliciting information about a specific topic. Audio recordings bring with it a lot of security. People feel much better if they think that they will leave an interview with a full recording of everything that is said, and this is true, or at least it usually is. You need to become familiar with your equipment before conducting any interviews. Recording may provide a secure way of keeping all of the data, but it can sometimes have a negative impact on the interview. Many people feel inhibited by the fact that their words are being recorded. It makes them very conscious of what they're saying and how they say it. And so you may choose to make a trade-off and opt for no recording in order to make your interviewee feel more comfortable. Of course, some interviewees could simply refuse to be recorded. This is their right, and you should always respect this. Unless your intention is to transcribe every word of the interview, there may be no real need to record at all. There is a fine balance between noting important information and remaining actively involved in the conversation. Each technique for recording has advantages and disadvantages. You have to decide the most appropriate technique for you and the most convenient in the situation. The important thing is that you leave the interview with all of the data that you need in the form you can understand. Your role here is to listen, reflect, and respond. You need to fully engage with the interview at all times. Transcription should be done as soon as the interview process is done. In the qualitative research, this means initial transcription and analysis, as you should be interpreting the data as you process it, noting themes as they emerge, and making notes in the form of memos. Open-ended, unstructured interviews allow the interviewee to talk at length about a topic. Very often, uh, this is at length. Not all of it is being pertinent to your research question. You may decide to transcribe every word. In ethnographic studies, and often studies, these should be the case. This should be the case. In surveys, it is more usual to be listening or reading for specific themes. In this case, then you may only choose to transcribe the relevant sections of a particularly significant section that you intend to use as evidence. This is not possible if you are taking a grounded theory approach, as the theory emerges from the data and you are not in the position to decide what is pertinent and what is not in the early stages of fieldwork. What you transcribe depends on the way that you've recorded the interview. Audio recordings allow you for full transcription, note-taking does not. But if you write up an interview immediately after leaving the interview, you will be in a much better position to remember how things were said and give more detail around the notes you have taken. Be careful when adding your own comments to handwritten notes. Make sure that you are not tempted to pad out what was said. Analysis of interviews will be discussed in a later video, but for now it is important to stress that the qualitative research analysis is consistent and constant. Ongoing elements of the research process. It begins during the interview, and each time you reflect on what you hear and ask a follow-up question, you'll have to engage in initial analysis. The verification stage refers to the extent to which the interview asked what was intended to ask. Did it answer the research question? It can also be seen as a form of member check. After the interviews have been transcribed and analyzed, it is possible to return to the interviewee and confirm that your interpretation matches theirs. Did you understand what they had intended you to understand? There is a possibility that the interviewee might deny something you thought that they had said. Reporting will be discussed in more in depth in a later video. But now, in your research report, your evidence from interviews will form the foundation of your emerging theory. Remember that the spoken word is evidence. Quite often, a lot of work goes into transcribing and analyzing. Then, when it comes to reporting, for some reasons, researchers forget that those verbatim quotes are evidence. Your interpretation of what was said is an essential part of your report, but the actual evidence on which you base that interpretation is also important. There are arguments for both and against the computer-mediated communication as a means of interviewing. This medium provides a sufficient benefit to encourage its use in many research studies. There are two approaches available to online interviewing: the synchronous and asynchronous approach. Synchronous or real-time interviewing involves the use of internet relay chat softwares, which can facilitate a live chat that allows real-time conversations between two or more people. The conversation takes place on a screen with both parties taking part at the same time in a virtual conversation. The only difference between the conventional conversations between the questions and responses are typically that they are rather than they are spoken. Asynchronous or non-real-time interviews involves the use of email and sometimes threads within a designated area. Questions are sent or posted to the designated space, and the respondents can add their reply at any time. Interviewing is well-established and well-used technique for data collection. The interview can take any form, from a highly structured research-administered questionnaire to a highly open, purposeful conversation. The choice depends upon the issues such as the researcher's experience, the nature of the research topic and the questions, access to research participants, and the time available for data collection. You need to think carefully about your choices before you design and engage in the interview process. If you guys like this video, please comment, subscribe, and hit that like button. I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.